Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be looking at Game 11 from the 2014 World Chess Championships. Magnus Carlsen is up a game. He's actually playing the white pieces today. And there's only potentially 12 games in this series, so if Magnus Carlsen can some way pull a victory out, he will be our champion. Anand gets to play the 12th game with the white pieces, so he's looking for at least a draw here, but if potentially he could have the upset with the black pieces for the win, he could actually go into tomorrow with the white pieces trying for the victory. So we'll go ahead and get started. Magnus Carlsen starting with white pieces, as we've seen before, pawn to e4. And Anand, up until this point, he's combated this with two different ways. One is the Berlin defense after pawn to e5, and the other has been the Sicilian defense, pawn to c5. He opts for the Berlin defense, pawn to e5, and then knight f3, knight c6, the Ruy Lopez, and then knight f6, the Berlin defense. Again, this is what they've played all throughout, and just 2 games ago in game number 9, they played possibly the fastest game I've ever seen in World Championship. It was about 20 moves. It lasted about an hour total, and they just kind of blazed through it. And for the beginning part of this game, they did the exact same thing. So they didn't waste a lot of time. Both sides, you could tell, had some novelty in their head that they wanted to play, and it was just kind of waiting back and forth to see who was actually going to make a variation from game number 9. So we see castle, knight taking here on e4, pawn up to d4. Again, these are all moves that we've seen all throughout the tournament. Bishop taking here, pawn taking here on c6, and then the exchange and the knight coming back here to f5. I was a little disappointed, to be honest, with Anand giving up his queen so early on. I know he's done in the past. It just hasn't done much for him. He's always done well in this tournament so far when he had his queen, actively putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. So to go down this line, maybe he has some crazy plan, but I was a little disappointed to see him give up that queen early on. King taking here on d8, a pawn to h3, and then we see our first novelty, and it comes from Anand. So you can tell that he's maybe prepared something that Magnus Carlsen may not be ready for. He plays bishop here to d7, different than the king to e8 line, which we've seen in the past. And usually when you see bishop to d7, and you don't try to centralize your king to e8, it's usually you're going to be rushing your king over here to the b7 square, which is a critical square in the Berlin defense. So he's kind of going for that option. Magnus Carlsen's going to just continue to develop his pieces. He has a pretty good board state right now. He has the only central pawn. He has a safe king over here. He can easily deploy all of his pieces and get them very involved into the action. So right now, pretty interesting to see how Anand attacks this, but Magnus Carlsen definitely has a good game going so far. We now see knight to c3, just developing move. Pawn here to h6, keeping this bishop off of g5. Also, the knight here on g5 can be pretty troublesome. Magnus Carlsen plays pawn here to b3. He had a few options of where he could have played. He could have brought his bishop to f4 if he wanted to. He just could have brought his rook over here to e1, get it behind your pawn so you can add more pressure to the central squares. Decided first to go ahead and play pawn here to b3, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop here to b2 and try to control this long dark diagonal here. King over here to c8, as we talked about, trying to get to the square here on b7, and then he wants to be able to connect his rooks. He definitely needs to make sure he gets his dark square bishop involved into the game. If it just sits back here on f8, that's not going to be good for Anand. Bishop here to b2, as we said before. Pawn here to c5, getting ready to push forward with pawn here to b6, kind of control all those dark diagonal squares for pawns on the queen side. Rook over here to d1, centralizing, attacking this bishop right here. Pawn here to b6. This king is protecting this bishop for now, but the bishop will definitely want to move so that the king can come here to b7. A rook over here to e1. And I really like this setup. If we kind of look at what both sides are looking to do, white has complete control of the center. He has both of his rooks connected. He's completed his development. He's castled, although, you know, with the queens off the board, he doesn't have to worry too much about king safety. But all of his minor pieces are very involved into the action. They're controlling the center. White has the only central pawn right here. For Anand, he hasn't moved his dark square bishop. He hasn't moved either of his rooks. They're definitely not connected. His light square bishop, right now, it's going to be difficult for him to really use it effectively, and he has to worry about this central pawn. So he's going to be looking to kind of open up the game, get his dark square bishop involved, maybe counterattack with these rooks. It maybe in the center of the board. board, it's not clear how he would attack on either the queen or the king side. There's just not a lot of options right now. So that's what both sides are going to be looking to do as we get into the later stages of the middle game. But I would definitely give the nod right now to Magnus Carlsen playing a very fundamentally sound game. Anand brings his bishop to e6, centralizing, just kind of stopping this pawn pushing forward and also making sure that his king doesn't have to protect the square on d7. Knight to d5. And this is interesting because if you look from black's perspective, a lot of times you'll actually see the knight come up here to e7 first because they just don't want to have to deal with the knight coming here to d5, but Anand actually welcomed it. He played this bishop here to e6 pretty confidently. Pawn here to g5, so starting to counterattack on the king side of the board. Pawn here to c4, just solidifying the center of the board right here. Magnus Carlsen now has a great outpost here on the d5 file, or the d5 square. He also, if he wanted to, he could use these squares up here, so the d6 or the f6 square. He could always play, you know, knight to d2 up to e4 and then here to f6. That would be a great outpost for his knight. On the other hand, Anand could bring his knight eventually if he wanted to. Knight to e7, and then he could always bring it to g6, and then he has his own outpost here on f4 if he wanted to take advantage of that. So there could be for a while some just maneuvering back and forth as both sides don't have a lot because it's kind of gridlock in the center of the board. So as they can just incrementally get a better position with their knights, that could definitely be a changing point in the game. Vishy finally brings his king to b7, which he wanted to do. Now his a-rook here is open to go ahead and get involved into the game. King over here to h2, kind of an important move if he ever wants to push forward with pawn to g4. Then he's only one move away to play king to g3 to protect that a little bit more than he has right now. Pawn to a5, so Vishy starting to counterattack on the queen side. Pawn to a4, just doesn't want to have to deal with that attack right now. Knight up here to e7, as we talked about, opening up the door if he wants to exchange here. That could be one thing. He could also bring it over here to g6 and then f4, which I think could be his best play. Pawn to g4, just stopping all of the potential threats that Anand might be thinking of. Knight over here to g6, which is definitely going to be good. King up here to g3, so more of a central square, which is always going to be good. Anand decides to go ahead and get his dark square bishop involved into the game. He plays bishop here to e7. I personally don't like this at all. I think if you're going to get your dark square bishop involved into the game, to go ahead and just play bishop here to g7, it still controls this pawn. It controls this long diagonal, and I just think all around it's just better. But both of these do open up the door for the rook to get involved. So after bishop here to e7, he does have his rooks connected. He has completed development, so that's definitely good. Knight over here to d2. Rook up here to d8, knight up here to e4. So we talked about getting ready to come to the square here on f6. Vishy brings his bishop back here to f8, which kind of had me scratching my head that he brought his bishop here to e7 and then just brought it back here to f8. I think he just would have been better if he had it here on g7. Knight up here to f6. So great outpost for Magnus Carlsen for both of his knights here. His knight here on d5 and f6 are controlling a lot of Anand's board. He has a very cramped position. There's just not a lot that he can actually do in this board state. He plays pawn here to b5. Another move I just don't like from Anand. I think he could have tried for something and made more. He could have played pawn here to c6, forcing this knight to move. So this knight, maybe it comes back here to e3. I guess it could come back here to c3. Maybe doesn't want to block off his dark square bishop. So knight to e3, and then knight here to f4. Nice outpost for Anand's knight right here. So that's going to be very good. Decided again in the game to go ahead and play pawn here to b5. I just don't think it's nearly as good. Bishop up here to c3, just waiting to figure out how he wants to defend all this. Pawn taking here on a4. We see the pawn recapture. And then the king up here to c6, trying to control this central square here on d5. This is definitely a critical square that both sides are going to be focusing on. So Magnus Carlsen starts to do the same thing. He plays king to f3, starting to come up the board as well. Rook over here to b8, trying to control some of the queen side, so definitely has some options over there. King up here to e4, and so both sides very central, kind of gridlock right now, so it's kind of anyone's game as far as who's going to take the first move here and actually try to go for a win, or they could just exchange all the material off, go for a draw, and then go into game number 12. And Anand decided to go ahead and bite first and decided, hey, I may not have a chance in the next game to actually get a victory, so I'm going to go for it here. And he plays rook to b4. Now, he did have kind of a safer option. He does control kind of the queen side, definitely this b file. He could have played rook here to b3. Safer move. He still has a lot of attacking options, but decided for the most aggressive line he could go for, and that is rook to b4, basically giving up material for in a pass pawn here so he could start to push forward. So that's definitely his plan right now, is to just make sure that he has damage control over here and then push forward for the win with his pawn here on b4. So Magnus Carlsen is going to bring his knight over here to h5. We now see the king come back here to b7. Pawn up here to f4. So Magnus Carlsen is going to try to kind of deflect some of the attention over here on the king side. He moved knight over here to h5, also protecting this square here on f4. So we do see the exchange right here. Now after the knight takes, the knight comes back here on f4. Anand, though, didn't have to take with his knight. He could have, again, he always has this in-between move of pawn here to c6. He was playing somewhat fast, though. I think he made a lot of mistakes, maybe missed a few miscalculations that kind of led to an advantage for Magnus Carlsen, but decided to go ahead and exchange off material right here, and then the bishop comes down on c4. So definitely opening up the door for him to start pushing forward over here. A rook up here to d7, very aggressive move from Magnus Carlsen. You always want your rooks not only on open files, but to control your opponent's 7th rank if you're white, or the 2nd rank if you're black. We now see rook here to a6. It's just not 100% clear how Anand, as he's sacrificing material and exchanging material off the board, how he's going to have nearly enough material to protect this pawn as it comes down here. But knight to d5, centralizing this knight. Very nice move from Magnus Carlsen. This knight and this rook are both attacking the square here on c7. So the rook comes up here to c6. Again, Anand, even though he kind of had that exchange, is still kind of in defense mode right here. And then we see the rook over here to f7, so getting some of that material back. Bishop to c5, centralizing a little bit. And then Magnus Carlsen plays what I think so far is the best move in the game, the best move that he's played for a while. Since the past few games, they haven't been doing anything too crazy at all. But he plays rook to c7, taking that pawn. After the exchange right here, he takes with his knights. And Anand can't really take with his king. You know, if he takes here on c7, then all of a sudden a rook over here to c1, he's going to lose one of these bishops. And then he just doesn't have the material. Bishop versus rook in the endgame with white having more pawns. That's definitely going to be bad. So Anand recognizes that this was just a great move by Magnus Carlsen. Decides to go ahead and play king to c6. He needs to hold on to his double bishop pair. Knight to b5. Another great move by Magnus Carlsen. Somewhat forces Anand, although he doesn't have to take it, but he definitely gets into trouble if he just allows Magnus Carlsen to kind of hang out here. So decides to go ahead and take, and then decides he's going to go ahead and push forward on the queen side, and that's kind of the last thing. Magnus Carlsen, he has his own pass pawn, so he's going to be pushing for the win up here with e6. Pawn here to b3. King over here to d3, just trying to stop any attack that Anand has. Bishop here to e7, needs to make sure that this pawn does not push forward any further. It does have protection from this rook. Even if Magnus Carlsen, you know, gave up this pawn, he'd definitely just take this bishop and it would be game over from here. It doesn't do too much if this pawn comes down here to b2, because after king to c3 or c2, you know, this pawn's just going to fall. So that's going to be bad. Decides to go ahead and play bishop here to e7. Pawn up here to h4. And this is a really good move as well. It kind of goes underappreciated sometimes of these small little moves that Magnus Carlsen does, but he recognizes that this bishop can't just take he just can't take this pawn right here on h4, because then this pawn could just march up the board. Even if he hangs his rook here on e1, the pawn's just going to come up the board right now. After pawn here to a4, he continues with pawn here to g5. Another great move. He recognizes that his opponent at some point would like to play bishop to f6 to kind of control this long diagonal right here. Pushing up this pawn here to a1 may be Vishy Anand's best option right here. So after the pawn takes, the pawn's now going to recapture here on g5, and this pretty much stops Vishy Anand being able to help these pawns over here. Again, Magnus Carlsen would be completely fine if he took here on g5, but that really doesn't do much good for Vishy Anand. Now the pawn to a3, king over here to c3, and Vishy Anand, this situation, is forced to resign. And Magnus Carlsen can easily just push these pawns up, and there's no way for him to protect his pawns over here. So Magnus Carlsen wins the game. Vishy Anand kind of went just all in, but I just think he didn't really calculate all the way through and just made a few miscalculations. I don't think in this particular game he played all that great in general. Magnus Carlsen, however, played fantastically. So he is the 2014 World Chess Champion, and he will be the champion for 2 more years when we come back in 2016 for the next chance for someone to dethrone him. So there will not be a Game 12, so for those fans that just like seeing matches, unfortunately, the tournament is over. But congratulations to Magnus Carlsen, back-to-back championships 2 years in a row. He is dominating. He also won the Rapid and the Blitz earlier this year, so he is just crushing chess right now. Excited to see him as he gets better and better. Thank you guys for watching the coverage in the entire series. Hopefully y'all are learning something, and definitely enjoy watching him, and I'll see you guys in the next tournament. Thanks for watching.